guys, in this video I'm going to explain about Amazon CloudFront. So what is Amazon CloudFront? So basically it's a content delivery network provided by Amazon. Before we actually jump into Amazon CloudFront and see how we can configure it, what's the benefits and all that stuff, let's talk about what is CDN in general. Now let's say you've got one server here. Let's say this is a web server, right? And this guy here in orange, this is the user. Now what happens generally if we don't have CDN? So then what happens? So your user accesses the web server directly and your server sends back the response. Now let's say you have multiple users and your users could be in anywhere in the world. They could be in Asia Pacific, in Europe, in United States, wherever it is. Now let's say these users right here on my right of the screen, these users are in Asia Pacific. They also need to access your server just like other users are doing directly without any CDN in place. So what happens in this case as your users grows up, and if your users are sitting far away from the actual location of the server, they experience a lot of latency and the performance of your website drops down drastically. So after some time, let's say your users have been increased to 5,000 for example, so one day your web server will also crash. There are chances for that. So how can we resolve this issue? How can we make the website loads up faster? It doesn't matter where users are sitting. They could be in US, they could be in Asia, they could be in Europe, they could be anywhere in the world. So what we generally do, we put a CDN in front of your web server. Now, what's the role of CDN here? CDN communicates with your web server and the users communicates with your CDN, not your web server directly. So let's say a user requests for a page index.php. This CDN will ask for the web server first time, give me index.php. Once it receives the index.php, it serves it back. Let's say this user also requests for the same page. At that point of time, this CDN will not go back to web server and ask for that page once again. It will provide that page from its cache itself. So it maintains a cache, right? So we can configure how much long we want to keep the files in cache. By default, for most of the CDNs, it's 24 hours. Even for Amazon CloudFront, it's 24 hours. But we can configure it, whatever the number we want. If the website is static website, we can use a bit higher number. But if we are using a dynamic website, then we can keep it lower. But the idea again is your users will communicate with your CDN and not with your web server. And another thing is you launch multiple CDNs and they all communicate with your web server. Now you can place these CDNs across the globe. You can distribute these CDNs so that if a guy is coming from Asia, he'll get connected with the nearest CDN rather than all the way coming to the web server itself. So it drastically decreases the load on your web server, and the advantage is that every user will get the site loaded up very fast. So this is the same concept which has been used by Amazon CloudFront. Now let's talk about Amazon CloudFront. When you start using Amazon CloudFront, you'll have to create a distribution. So a distribution actually needs one origin point. Origin point could be your S3 bucket or could be any other HTTP server where you save your files. Basically, it needs a source where your data is so that it can pull the data and give it to the users. So let's start by clicking on the create distribution, and here you have two types of distribution. One is download and one is streaming. A download distribution uses HTTP or HTTPS protocols to serve the data to the users. But if you are serving media files, video files, and if you want to stream your media, then always use streaming distribution type. It uses RTMP, real-time media protocol, provided by Adobe's Flash Media Server. Now, for example, what's the difference between these two? Let's say you want to stream your video using download distribution. What happens is, first the video will be downloaded to user's local system, and then it will start streaming. In other case, if you're using streaming method, as soon as user will see first few bytes, video will start playing. It will not wait for the video to download fully, but it will start playing the video as soon as it receives first few bytes. So this is the main difference. Most of the times we stick with download distribution only. Now here you have to specify the origin domain name. Where are your files? You have to give the source. Let's say my files are in this particular bucket. I'm using S3 as the origin. You can even use your own custom origin. It could be your HTTP endpoint. But what we need is actually, we need to give some sort of endpoint where your data is. So whatever the information that you provide here, CloudFront will go there and search for the requested files. It needs to be there. So here you can specify the origin ID. You can keep the name whatever you want here. Restrict bucket access. We'll talk about this later on. First, try to deploy a distribution without any restriction. Path pattern is always default. What type of protocols that you want? Let's stick with the basics. And object caching. Now when it fetches the object from the source, it receives cache value in the header of the data. Let's say my CloudFront is fetching a file from this particular bucket. So when it fetches that file header will contain the value of cache. How long you want to keep that data in cache. So what it defines here is, do you want to use that cache value or you want to specify your own value here? This is the main difference. So let's say we specify our own value. Forward cookies, keep as it is. Forward query strings, no. Restrict viewer access, we'll talk about this later on. Price class. Now where you want to deploy your distribution. Amazon CloudFront, whenever you create a distribution in Amazon CloudFront, it distributes that across all its edge locations. In US, in AP, in Europe, everywhere. So if you want to distribute only in US and Europe, you can select this, US, Europe and Asia. And if you want to deploy it on all the edge locations, you can keep this thing. Now whenever you generate a distribution or create a distribution, Amazon CloudFront gives you a randomly generated domain name. And if you want your own domain name, let's say you have got your own domain, and if you want to access this particular CloudFront using your domain instead of using CloudFront's domain, you give your domain name here. Let's say mycdn.nextport.com. So this is my domain, nextport.com, and mycdn.nextport.com is the CNAME that I'll create for this particular CloudFront. But keep in mind one thing, when you are creating these CNAMEs, you have to go to your domain names registrar, log in there and create a CNAME entry for this particular domain name. SSL certificate, the default one, default root object. Let's say when you hit this particular domain name, what should open first? Let's say open index.html. So whenever this domain will be accessed, this file will be opened. So this is the default root object, whatever you want to execute when your domain will be opened. Logging on or off. Whenever you access your CloudFront, the access logs will be generated, and these logs are industry standard W3C compliant, so that you can use any third-party log analysis tool, for example Splunk, to view these logs or analyze these logs. Now where you want to save those logs, let's say save it in this particular bucket, and you have to specify prefix also, my logs. Cookie logging off. comment, no comments, and distribution state enabled. Let's deploy the distribution. Now, as you can see, the status is in progress. It will take 10 to 15 minutes to deploy this distribution. Now what happens is, now we have got a bit of information here. As you can see, this particular domain name, it has been generated by CloudFront, and this is the domain name which I'll map in my domain name registrar's account, right? So what happens is, using this particular domain name or this particular domain name, what you will get, you will access all the files which are stored in this particular bucket, because we are using this bucket as the source, or you can say origin of this particular distribution. This is the ID or name of the origin, and this is the type of the origin. We are using S3 origin. We will talk about origin access identity and origin protocol policy and all that stuff, and I'll show you what's the difference between that and why we need that. But first, let's talk about the basic stuff. Now this distribution, or you can say this particular domain name, is the one which users will access. Now it will be deployed across all the edge locations. You can see the locations from here. All these locations, it will be deployed. So a person sitting in Singapore will access Asia Pacific edge location. They will not go to US. And a person sitting in US will not come to Singapore. So the biggest advantage is that latency will be very minimal, or I can say there will be no latency at all. Now the status has been changed to deployed. It means we are ready to use this distribution. Now first, let's see what's in that particular bucket which we need to access. Check out the data in the bucket. So we have got test.html file. Let's try to access that using this default domain name which CloudFront created for us. Copy this thing and so as you can see, this is a test.html. So test.html file got accessed using the CloudFront's URL. And as you may recall, when we did configuration of Amazon S3 buckets, that also provides us one domain. This is the domain of Amazon S3 bucket. You can also access the same file using S3 domain name. But if you are using in this way, we are not actually taking advantage of Amazon CloudFront's capabilities. So most of the times we need to access the data using CloudFront only. So what we can do, we can restrict this access. What we want, we do not want our users access the data using the bucket name, but we want to force everybody to use CloudFront so that they can access the data. We can configure this thing in private content. This is where your origin access identity will come into the picture. But before we jump into this topic, let's try to create the CNAME first. So as you can see, this domain name is randomly generated, and this is something you cannot remember. So let's try to make something more rememberable, which you can actually memorize. Let's go to your domain name registrar. So my registrar is GoDaddy, so I go to my domain and I quickly add the CNAME for this domain. Just copy this thing and paste and save your zone file. So usually it takes a couple of minutes to propagate the changes, at the max 1 hour. Let's try to access. So this is a test.html file. So now I do not need to use this domain name to access my distribution. I can use my own domain name. So far we have seen that we can access the bucket, or you can say test.html in that bucket using bucket URL as well as the CDN URL. But what I want is my users should not be able to access this file or any file in this bucket using the bucket domain name, because if they do so, they will not be using the capabilities and functionalities that my CloudFront provides. So I want to force my users to use the CloudFront URL to access the objects in the bucket rather than using the S3 URL. So this is where your origin access ID will come into the picture. Right now you can see there is no origin access identity, but we have to create that. Click on edit, strict bucket access, enable this thing, and here you have to specify either you can create a new identity, you just have to provide the name here, that's it, or use an existing identity. So there are a lot of identities that I created earlier, so let's try to create a new identity, my test user, and automatically update my bucket policy. Now when we create this origin access identity, basically it creates a special user by this name, and only this user will have access to fetch all the objects within the bucket, and everybody else will not be able to access the bucket objects directly. They have to pass through this CloudFront URL in order to access the objects. And to make these changes take effect, we will update the bucket policy. So once this will be done, you can see this string has been generated. So this is a special user. Only this user will have access on all the objects within this particular bucket. Now if you go back to your distributions, you can see that it has started redeploying this particular CloudFront. Let's go back to S3, go to the properties of your bucket, go to permissions. So here you can see edit bucket policy. This policy has already been added, and this is the user we just created. This is the CloudFront URL, and only this user will have allow access to fetch every object on this particular bucket. So this is how this policy has been updated by default, and you can remove these extra permissions and click on save. Now go back to CloudFront once again. Once your distribution will be deployed, then we'll see what are the changes that happened. Now as you can see, this distribution has been deployed. Now let's try to access this first with your CloudFront domain, and it's working. And now let's try to access the same file using the S3 domain name. And see, access is denied. So it means users can access any object in this particular bucket only using the CloudFront domain, and they will not be able to bypass that by using straight away this S3 domain. So this is how you can restrict your bucket policy. Thanks for watching, guys.